We're going to pick back up where we left off with Solomon. Remember King Solomon, his sins, as much as the good stuff that he did, led to really the moral decline of the nation as a whole. His son Rehoboam, in his greed and heavy taxation, split the kingdom. Remember, this is where we left off here. So now we're left with Judah, southern kingdom. The kings there will follow the lineage of David, but the northern kingdom is Israel. Its capital is the city of Samaria. The first guy there is, it just got a lot louder. The first guy there is Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam, he's a bad guy, but he's smart because he realizes, worship is in Jerusalem. That's where the temple is. That's where it's at. You go there to worship Yahweh. And so in response to that, he says, you know what, forget that. And at Dan, north of the Sea of Galilee, and Bethel, near the border of Judah, you got to go through Bethel to really get to Jerusalem, he puts up places of worship. And so his idea is, I would lose my subjects to worship in Jerusalem, so I need places of worship for our own country. And they're not even worshiping Yahweh. He puts up golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Now, for those of you familiar in the Old Testament, you're probably like, I've heard that one before at the base of Mount Sinai in Exodus 32, I believe. So this is a very ominous and pretty obvious foreshadowing as to where on earth the northern kingdom, Israel, is headed. It's not a good one. But you get Jeroboam, and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I get to 7 kings, so it sounds like a long time, and we're going to be looking at King Ahab the next couple of times I am up here. Now, you hear 7 kings, you get to Ahab, and you're like, that sounds like a long time. It's not that long. It's just over 50 years between Jeroboam, the first king in the northern kingdom, to this guy, Ahab. That's because God is just wreaking out havoc and judgment on these wicked kings. And so here's the situation. Jehoshaphat, we'll look at him next Sunday, but he's a ruler or king of the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, Israel, you got this guy, Ahab. Samaria is the capital city. He marries a wonderful woman named Jezebel, who we're going to talk about in just a minute, in Sidon. Sounds like you guys some of you are at least familiar with her. If you notice, she's Sidon way up there. That's not in Israel. And we've talked about that multiple times, and we talked about that with Solomon, why that's not the best idea. So quick background here, just one more minute. There's a guy named Elijah. Some of you don't remember him, prophet of Yahweh, and he's in Israel. People aren't fans of Yahweh at the time, and he's like, look, there's going to be a drought, there's judgment, there's a showdown between the prophets of like the Ashtaroth and of Baal, and they say, whichever God miraculously lights up this sacrifice, that's the true God, and Elijah's mocking them for cutting themselves, like maybe your God's asleep, and then when Yahweh speaks, it is clear who is God. It's embarrassing for King Ahab, for the false prophets. And the false prophets, many of them are killed and chased away. But because of that, Ahab, and particularly his wife Jezebel, want Elijah dead for this debacle. And they chase him. He ends up running away. I found this slide is interesting. It overlays Texas over the ancient Near East. I know. Imagine walking everywhere in Texas. It takes forever to drive through Texas, and imagine having to walk around. But so we're in Israel, and Elijah goes running off actually to Mount Sinai. He does come back to the Damascus area, but that's the quick background leading up to 1 Kings chapter 21. If you want to open up your Bibles there, and the Pew Bibles, that'll be page 357. In those red Pew Bibles, 1 Kings chapter 21 really focuses around this evil king, Ahab. He's already been doing wicked things, and this kind of is like the pinnacle of it. 1 Kings 21. So, good place to start would be verse 1. Here we go. Now Naboth, here's this guy, Naboth, the Jezreelite, has a vineyard in Jezreel. It's a city beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Now, New Testament Samaria is a region. Remember, Samaria, Old Testament here, city. This is a city. So again, back to this map. Here's the capital, Samaria. We're in Jezreel up here. It's roughly 25 miles away, but this is where the kings winter or summer house is. It's his second palace, right? You're wealthy as the king. And it's a nice place. If you were to live anywhere, you'd probably want to live here in Jezreel. Hence the name, it's in the Jezreel Valley. This is what it looks like today. But even back then, without modern day, crops and irrigation and all that, it was the most fertile land in Israel. So if you want the best food, the green views and hills and all that, and the finest wine, this is a place you go to. So it makes sense why the king would have his, summer house, so to say. And it must be a stunning vineyard because they're neighbors. Verse 1, Ahab has this palace that's next to this nice vineyard that Naboth, this guy we just met, that Naboth owns. And Ahab comes to him in verse 2, says, give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden because it's near my house. And I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I'll give you its value in money. Hey, I know Ahab's evil, but this seems pretty reasonable. You're like, oh, give me this worth of money, a better vineyard even? Oh, that doesn't sound too bad at all. It sounds more than fair. But the response is kind of shocking at first glance. Yahweh forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And you're kind of like, whoa. Relax. That feels really aggressive. Can you imagine on Facebook Marketplace or something like that where Caleb's selling you $50 for a bookshelf and you're like, I'll offer you $50. I'm like, God forbid you should have my bookshelf. You'd be like, hey, that's really personal and aggressive. Now, we're looking at that from 21st century Western eyes here in the United States. To the Hebrew reader and listener of this text, they would get it. Let me further explain on this. First of all, there's lots of different ways to translate it. One I found was this, that it's profanation, it's profane. This is profanation for me from Yahweh to give you the inheritance of my fathers. When you hear the word profane, that puts a different twist to it, as opposed to what we're reading here, the Lord forbid. What's going on here? Well, Naboth is actually being faithful to Yahweh while everyone else in Israel is not. It's a big deal. Like I said, Yahweh's not popular in the northern kingdom right now. This goes back to the whole story of the Bible. It says a lot. This is a big deal. The promise to Abraham, Genesis 17:8, one verse, God said, hey, your family, your ancestors after you, they're going to have this promised land is what we call it. So that's the starting point, but it continues from there. A good passage, Numbers 26, 52 and 53. Yahweh spoke to Moses, and among the tribes the land shall be divided for inheritance according to the number of names. Okay, that word inheritance is going to come up again and again. God told Moses, hey, the land's essentially going to be divided equally amongst tribes. That's what the book of Joshua is pretty much about. Going into the promised land as God leads them. It's from God. Levitical law, Leviticus 25. God says the land shall not be sold in perpetuity. Pretty clear. For the land's mine. Everything belongs to God. For you are strangers. You are sojourners with me. And the rest of Leviticus 25 talks about the year of Jubilee. If you somehow lost your property, it would be restored to you in the land of Jubilee. It's like debt forgiveness, pretty much. So you could have your ancestral family land back. It's that important. Another passage from Numbers, Numbers 36, verse 7. The inheritance of the people of Israel shall not be transferred from one tribe to another. Pretty clear. For every one of the people of Israel shall hold on to the inheritance, there's that word again, of the tribe of his fathers. This is what Naboth has in the back of his mind. And there are a bunch of other passages as well. It's a gift from God. It's not to be sold. It's from his family. That's what he has in mind when he says, Yahweh forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. Now, one other thing about this word inheritance in my studies was interesting is even upon just hearing the word inheritance, if you were Hebrew, you'd think of all these things. The word itself, nachala, has the description is it's not like me getting an inheritance from my mom's dishes or something like that. That's not what we're talking about here. The word itself has to do with the distribution of the land to the people. That's what he had in his mind. And this is a big deal that God would give them land, because when we go back hundreds of years in Pharaoh, who owns all the land in Egypt? Pharaoh. And so here it's a big deal for everyone to have their own land. It's a gift from God. And for us, land, you might think freedom and things like that, but for them it's your grocery store, it's everything. It's not just having like a front porch. You want to make a living being a farmer of some kind, or maybe you watch over sheep. You need land. It's crucial for them just to survive. And every time they'd hear this word, all these things would come up to them. So all of that background, I'm really making this point, but all of that background is for Naboth. He understood all this without having to think about it like we do. He says, no, the Lord forbids this. And to the Hebrew reader or listener of this story, this is obvious to them. It's just because we're outside of that ancient context of the old law. I mean, good idea for us to probably read more of the old law. But Naboth is faithful to the rules and principles and commands of God. His sons are supposed to inherit this land. So Ahab's question is just purely economic. It's an exchange of goods. The response from Naboth it's theological. It's no, God forbids this. And of course, I doubt Ahab knows a lot about this, but Ahab, verse 4, he goes to his house. He's vexed, sullen because of what he was told by Naboth. And he says, I will not, because Naboth said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face, and he would eat no food. And it's kind of embarrassing. You're like, give me a break. Like, this is the king of Israel. This guy is throwing like a fit. He's like a tempered, it's just temper, and then it's just really sad. It seems like someone who seems rather arrogant. He's just not going to eat. He's just pouting, as if he didn't have enough already. He's in his second palace. He's got 2 of these, and he's whining that he didn't get exactly what he wanted. Well, here comes his wife in verse 5. Jezebel, his wife, she's like, hey, why is your spirit so vexed and you're not eating food? And he said, because I spoke to Naboth, the Jezreelite, and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or else if it please you, I'll give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. I don't know how much to put into this, but that's not what Naboth said. I don't know if he's just summarizing it or if he's trying to paint him defiant. I don't know. I think Ahab's pretty, if I had to guess, ignorant of the old, or what we have now is the old law. But Jezebel, we mentioned her briefly in the opening, and you guys chuckled. It seems like she's resonated with many of you. She's trouble. When we first meet King Ahab in 1 Kings 16, it talks about how he's worse than Jeroboam. And not only that, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbaal. Look at that name. It's got Baal in it. King of the Sidonians. She went and served Baal. So that's what happened. They worshipped him. They erected altars for Baal. This is why God told the Israelites, don't go marry foreigners. This is what's going to happen. They're going to pull you into idolatry. This could be a whole other sermon and whatnot. We don't have the same laws in a new covenant. But definitely, for I guess the younger people, we got to think about who you marry. It will affect your life. But Jezebel, this non-Israelite, worshiping Baal. We look at idolatry today and we're kind of like, why? It's so weird to us. But picture, again, all the scientific and technological things you have and know of, that's gone. If you just somehow are able to put that out of your mind and you're just your average farmer in Israel at this time, you haven't seen the conquest of the land, you haven't seen miracles, you've heard maybe stuff about the Exodus, but you haven't really seen these things. And your family's going hungry, and things are not going well for you and your crops, and someone tells you, hey, there's someone who controls the weather and fertility, this god Baal. He must be mad at you. You must not be pleasing him. As a matter of fact, he's endorsed by the king. This is the national god at this time. Maybe try that. Much more tempting in that situation. And because of fertility with Baal, there's all kinds of historical things where it just kind of gets blurred. It ends up being like human fertility, which leads to a bunch of weird sexual stuff and sins. Even some discussed with Baal as well as Molech, even of human sacrifice, often babies. That was rare, but it happened in this time period. Hey, nothing's new today. I think of abortion with that one. I might think of people who just want stuff and sell their souls, as the phrase we would say for it. Our culture's very obsessed with things of sex and things of riches and glamour. Nothing's new. It's just in different packaging. I say all that so to remind you who this Jezebel woman is, what she's brought upon this kingdom. And she's perplexed at all this. That Naboth would say, no, you're not having my vineyard. She says, do you now govern Israel? Arise, eat bread, let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite. She's like, aren't you the king? Shouldn't you get what you want? Now, obviously, even for Israel and Judah as king, they had way more power than what we would be comfortable with in a democracy than that we even know. But compared to all the other kingdoms and kings in the ancient Near East, the kings of Israel and Judah are supposed, by the law of God, to be much more limited than the rest of the kings, like in Egypt or Babylon. What the king says goes. That's not how it's supposed to be amongst God's people. So to Jezebel, this is just shocking that the king would be told no. And she's saying, don't worry, honey, I'll take care of it for you. And you begin to see who kind of runs this relationship in verse 8. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with a seal. Who she sent these letters to? The elders, okay, should be wise, and leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. That's the city of Jezreel. So not nationwide, just the city of Jezreel. So Ahab's wicked, but kind of weak. Jezebel's wicked and strong. What about these people who she's writing the letters to? And what's this plan? Okay, verses 9 and 10, this is the plan. She says, let's proclaim a fast, set Naboth at the head of the people. So the idea in the ancient Near East would be, something's gone wrong. That's why we're fasting, no matter what religion it was. We need to fast, convene. Naboth will kind of be like the head of the committee, if you will. He's in a place of honor. And we're going to set two worthless men, verse 10, opposite him. Let them bring a charge against him, saying, you've cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. That's the plan. Pretty wicked plan, obviously. But in these two verses here, I just noticed this is like everything that God lays out that he specifically hates in Proverbs 6, pretty well known, verses 16 through 19. There are 6 things that Yahweh hates. 7 are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes. Definitely, we've already seen the arrogance of Ahab and now Jezebel. A lying tongue. That's kind of the plan. Hands that shed innocent blood. That's the end result of the plan. Let's kill Naboth. A heart that devises wicked plans. That's what Jezebel's doing right now. She's sending people, feet that make haste to run to evil, sending people to do this in a false court, or in the court of law. They're going to have false witnesses and breathe out lies. And by killing this guy, they're sowing discord among their own brothers. I mean, congratulations. You hit every single thing here in Proverbs 6. This is why they're just the horrible duo. They're so wicked. It's just natural. This is what they do. So what about the elders and the leaders? Is someone going to say, no, this is unlawful. We're going to serve Yahweh, not Baal, not this crazy stuff. This belongs to Naboth. We're not supposed to be doing this. The elders and the leaders who lived in the city, they did as Jezebel had sent word to them. So what I'm understanding here is this nation has become so wicked and devoid of God that even the people who are supposed to be wise, the people who are supposed to be godly leaders, are evil. And it's only been 50-something years since the split. It does not take long to end up on such a sad trajectory. Evil nation. So the plan goes into motion, verses 12 and 13. They proclaim a fast. Naboth's put in a place of honor, the head of the people. 2 worthless men come in. They sit opposite. Worthless men bring a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people. It's pictured like a courtroom-like scenario and discussion. And the charge is Naboth cursed God and the king. Even Ahab he's cursed. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. I'd imagine Naboth protested, you're lying, I never did such a thing. I'm trying to obey God. I never cursed the king. It's evil. Now notice this, 2 worthless men. Hey, for those of you who might recall, what would be significant about having 2 worthless men accuse him? It ironically and strangely enough matches with the law. You can only have a legal case with at least 2 witnesses. And this is not just this story. This is a weird thing that pops up new and a lot in the Old Testament where it's a mix of ignorance, it's a mix of just justification, not sure. But throughout the history of Israel, you'll see times where people do follow God in certain areas to To some degree, at least they think they are, and then ignore like everything else. Really strange that they would follow this. They've got their two witnesses, if you're doing it by the book, so to say. As a matter of fact, the accusation matches up. That's lawful. Cursing God or blaspheming God, the punishment for that, they say, is to execute him, to stone him. We go to Levitical law. Those who blaspheme the name of Yahweh are to be put to death. Whoever blasphemes the name shall be put to death. Blasphemy was punishable in the old law by death. They're not wrong with the sentencing if that was the case. That's moral, what would you call this? That would be moral law. And then next we see like ceremonial law. They took him outside the city. You see this principle in Numbers 15. There's a guy who works on the Sabbath. And it was after all the amazing miracles had done with these people and the covenant Yahweh had made with the Israelites. And this guy breaks the covenant. He's like, whatever. He goes working on the Sabbath. And God says, this man's to be put to death. The whole congregation will stone him outside the camp. And you see this practice Old and New Testament. Stephen in Acts 7. Taken outside the city. This is what happens. This is ceremonially clean. So all that's in verse 13. They took him, threw him out of the city. So they do all this by the book, if you can even call it that, and they've just mangled and twisted the law of God in order to fit their evil schemes. And you did it by the book. You missed everything else. If you read the rest of Deuteronomy 19, you'd hear a lot about proper and true justice that God is zealous for. Hey, I'm willing to wager most of us here with our hearts are intending to kill. That would be a great starting point. But for our sake, I've seen this in my past where we try to justify or minimize something. It's not a big deal, and you kind of pick and choose what you like. It's not that big of a deal. Or on the other end of the spectrum, like with the Pharisees, you can kind of pick and choose. And very often between, whether it's legalism or it's justification of yourself, very often we'll just pick little things and miss the point, miss the whole message of the text. That's what these guys had done to Naboth. But not only that, hey, remember this is a collectivist society. We're individualistic in the West, very individualistic. Naboth received the land. I know it's from God, but Naboth received the land from who? Probably his dad, right? Those before him. Who's his land going to go to? Well, his sons, you would assume. So, spoiler alert, Ahab and his family is going to be condemned and judged. I'm going to put the one verse on the screen here. It's alarming, and I never realized this till this study around, but in 2 Kings chapter 9, there's this guy who's evil, but he's being used by God, named Jehu, who's taken out the family of Ahab as judgment from God. And he recalls this in verse 26 of 2 Kings chapter 9. As surely as I saw yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, declares Yahweh, I'll repay you on this plot of ground. It's not just Naboth who is killed. It's his sons as well. Now, for us, when we read back in 1 Kings 21:13, we think it's just Naboth. For someone who's in a Hebrew in the ancient Near East, they would put two and two together because they're collectivists, a family. Oh, dad goes, the sons are going. But it doesn't say this. I can't be dogmatic about it, but likely the women would have gone as well. Doesn't say, pretty likely. So this is just horrible. You've wiped out a whole family, Naboth, just so you could get this vineyard. He's murdered. Everyone's wicked. The people, the queen, the king. They go to Jezebel. They say, hey, Naboth's been stoned. He's dead. As soon as Jezebel hears that, 1 Kings 20:15, she goes to her husband, King Ahab. She says, arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth's not alive, but dead. And Ahab's like a kid on Christmas morning. He doesn't think anything of it. He's like, oh, sweet. Just gets up, arose to go down in the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, takes possession of it. It doesn't belong to King Ahab, does it? In his mind, he's like, oh, he's an executed criminal. Cool, it's mine. I'm the king. But this coveting, betrayal, lying, murdering. Now, there's echoes of like David and Bathsheba, but David's nowhere near, obviously. David's a good man overall. He sinned. But you hear these echoes. These kinds of themes are ringing around and happening again and again. Naboth was only being obedient to the word of his God, being loyal to his family. Now, our song leader tonight, Ethan, has given you a really strong hint. Hopefully you guys have been picking up. I don't know where you guys have thought about it, but where have we seen some echoes of Jesus and the cross compared to Naboth here and his vineyard? There's quite a bit. I might have even missed some. There's so many. For starters, 1 Kings 21, verse 1, there's this vineyard. Naboth the Jezreelite owns a vineyard. A very common tool or place that Jesus would use in his stories and teachings and parables. The clearest one that's really close to this is in Matthew chapter 21. Verse 33, Jesus says, "Here another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard." Planted a vineyard. And Jesus goes on to say the story, hey, when the fruit drew near and it was time to, pick the fruit and all that, the tenants, they took the servants who were sent by the master, beat one, killed another, stoned another. Again, they sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Now, Jesus in Matthew 21 is kind of giving a whole picture of what we know as the Old Testament, that God sent prophets, and they were killed and persecuted. As a matter of fact, at this time in 1 Kings 21, Elijah is the persecuted prophet by Ahab and Jezebel. But it goes further than that, because then the master says, hey, they'll respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his, here's our English word again, inheritance. Let's take his inheritance. Well, that's what happened to Naboth, if you go back. Verse 2, 1 Kings 21, give me your vineyard, says King Ahab. And Naboth said, God forbid I do this. It's the inheritance of my fathers. The king wanted his inheritance. The plan, verses 9 and 10 of 1 Kings 21, there's already a pre-plan of just a kangaroo court of we're just going to throw them in there and then execute them. Jesus, too, obviously, was hunted down and plotted against by other powerful leaders. And they both had envy. One envy of a vineyard, one envious and scared of what Jesus was doing and what he was going to do. You get crazy stuff like in Matthew 12, Jesus heals a man with a deformed hand on the Sabbath. And instead of rejoicing and worshiping, the Pharisees say, you know what? We need to kill this guy. They conspire against Jesus. How are we going to destroy Jesus of Nazareth? John 11 is another good one. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and their thought is, we need to stop this. Matter of fact, they say in John 11:53, from that day on, they made plans to put him, Jesus, to death. Very much so an echo of Naboth. Planning, lots of planning. And then you've got the charge. We would call this false witnesses, so would Deuteronomy 19. They bring a charge against Naboth. Well, with Jesus, they were straight up seeking false testimony against Jesus. Jezebel was seeking false testimony against Naboth. And many false witnesses come forward, and the stories are not adding up with Jesus. But hey, remember, at least they're getting the things right. They got their two worthless men. They got their two witnesses to make sure, it counts. And that's what the Pharisees did as well. Back in Matthew chapter 26, two come forward. Hey, this man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days, which is true. Like, oh, sweet, we got two guys cooperating. It matches. We're obeying God. We got the law. Of course, they're killing an innocent man. Jesus is silent, and they just ask him, hey, we adjure you by the living God, tell us if you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Excuse me. And Jesus makes a claim of deity. You've said so, but I tell you, from now on, you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, Daniel 7, and coming on the clouds of heaven, like Isaiah 19. And they hear that, and they're not pleased with that, because that would be blasphemy. Naboth was accused of blasphemy. You've cursed God. You blaspheme God, you should be executed for that. In 1 Kings 21:13. Hey, hopping back to Matthew 26, they say, you've heard his blasphemy. What more do you need? How many more witnesses do we need? What's your judgment for blasphemy? They say he deserves death. Same thing. Same thing. But it wasn't just blasphemy against God. Naboth is also accused of cursing the king. You've cursed God and Ahab. Who do you think you are? He's our king. That same idea happens to Jesus. I think Eddie was reading that this morning at the table. In John chapter 19, they tell Pilate, the Jews say, hey, if you release this man, Jesus, you're not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Same idea with Naboth. Blaspheming for both of them, opposing the king for both of them. And what do they do at the end of this result of perverted justice in court? Well, Jesus sums it up. Matthew 21:39. They took him, threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed them. Here's all the comparisons here. There's probably more. If you're inclined to take a picture, this would be a good one too. If you just want this information, I'll always send it to you, of course. But we have this vineyard analogy going on between the two. I didn't talk much about this with Jesus. We went in great length about it with Naboth. They both obeyed God. I mean, Jesus is perfect. He obeyed his Father perfectly. Philippians 2:8, I think, really sums it up well, that Jesus was obedient even to the point of death. They're both envied. They're both plotted against. They're both falsely charged and condemned by the law, right? And part of that law is they're both accused of blasphemy toward God and then of being against the king. And then the last thing I'll talk about in just one quick second is they're unjustly executed, but they're executed outside of the city, right? Jesus is not crucified in Jerusalem. Calvary is outside of the city of Jerusalem. I'm about to change the slide. If you guys want these notes, let me know. Or it's the last second for a photo, if that's what you're looking for. I see some of you writing. Pretty sad state. Now, this is what is called, here, I'll give you a little more time here. This is what's called typology. You guys may have heard of that. Always do theology first. Theology, like the study of God, do that first before you go looking for typology or types of Christ in the Old Testament. Some weird things happen in the religious world where people do typology first and then try and cram it into what God is. That's the backwards way to go about it. Trying to think of an example. I don't know. There's lots of, like in Catholic Church, they got it where they believe Mary never sinned, which we would say is, that's impossible. Only God is good. We did theology first and then come over here. How they did that was, hey, the Ark of the Covenant carried the Word of God. Mary carried the Word. The Ark would say, okay, therefore Mary must be so. So you get it backwards. You see what's going on there. We always do the study of God first, then we come to the typologies. There's so many. Jesus sums this up, Matthew 21:40. Hey, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what is he going to do to those tenants? That's a good question. That's an ominous question, is it not? We're going to answer that further this Sunday morning. What is going to happen to King Ahab and Jezebel and those who have wickedly defied Yahweh and killed one of his righteous people and his family in such a way? But remember, we pointed out, Naboth was taken outside the city, executed. Followed the law, ceremonially clean. And Jesus was taken outside of Jerusalem. Justin Duncan's been reading these in Leviticus. I invite you guys to check it out. Leviticus 4:11 through 12. It's not just about being an executed criminal, but Jesus is a perfect sacrifice. The skin of the bull and all its flesh, its head, its legs, its entrails, its dung, all the nasty things that are left over from the sacrifice, they're to be carried outside the camp, and that's where they're burned. That's Leviticus 4:11 and 12. That's what's supposed to happen. So Jesus is not just taken outside as a criminal, even though he's innocent. He's taken out of the city as the sacrifice. And that's what Hebrews 13 leads us on. Verses 11 and 12. The bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. That's the church. That is us. Our king was thrown out of the vineyard for his people. I know many of us I don't know you guys' story right now. I hope we should know each other better. I know we got lots of things going on in this world in our lives personally. If we've been justifying and using God's word to justify our lives, we need to stop, turn around, and repent. If we've been doing the things that the Lord hates, like we read in Proverbs 6, whether it's causing disunity and lying and seeking and planning to do evil, we need to repent. The good news is God is like that father waiting for us to come back. And the only reason this was able to happen is that everything is from God, for God, and to God. Because there's no other gods, no Baal or anything like that. He alone is God, and for that reason, we are saved. If we can help you with anything tonight in your spiritual life, let us know or come forward right now while we stand and sing.